So the brilliance of Bill Mitchell, besides hiring Sharon Carlson, was to recognize the power of grassroots groups. When many analysts would say you get things done in the nuclear arena by moving legislation, and to do that you need to get expertise and technical knowledge and numbers and charts and documents and graphs, and that this is a matter for military and policy experts and not mere mortals like us. Somehow Bill knew that power also resides in stories, and that's what we're going to just remind ourselves of for the next hour or so. The real world experiences of real people, and that bringing people together to share and tell their stories is an exercise in exponents, not in addition, but in multiplying the power. So if you listen to Lisa Crawford and the revelations of contamination in her tap water, you immediately understand the dark underbelly of the nuclear weapons enterprise. And you understand how secrecy did more than protect the technical details of bomb building, and how the quest for security was an illusion all along. That's one story, and I hope she may tell a little bit of that. If you listen to Lisa Crawford's story, you might also understand the roots of true power in her righteous anger. The first time I saw it was my first DC days in Washington, D.C., and we got a meeting with the Secretary of Energy, Admiral James Watkins, and the room was shaped in a large horseshoe with the Secretary up at the head table, and we were lined down both sides, and it was time to present him with our report card, and many of us were a little bit, wow, Secretary of Energy. And Lisa Crawford got up from her seat and walked down to the end of the horseshoe and right up the middle and shook her finger at the Secretary of Energy and said, "We have a report card for you, sir, and frankly, you're not doing all that well." And that was an understatement, because he had failed. So these four storytellers and Bob Schaeffer, who is an amplifier, who made sure these stories were heard, will be our pleasure for the next session. Lisa Crawford from Fernald Residence for Environmental Safety and Health, Marylia Kelley from Tri-Valley Cares, Pam Kingfisher, who cut her teeth with NACE, and Natalia Mironova with the Russian Movement for Nuclear Safety, and of course Bob Schaeffer with Public Policy Communications. Take it away, and I'll give you a little time signal when you have a minute left. Don't push me, Lisa.
I'm going to stand up. I am really technically challenged too, and somebody else put this PowerPoint thing together for me. So, and I don't really I hate these things. I just talk. This is going to be really hard to do in 10 minutes. FRESH was started in the fall of 1984. There were rumblings and rumors in our community that there had been humongous dust releases from a very noxious facility that sat on 1,050 acres, that nobody really knew what they did. It sort of mirrors Christian Iverson's story, almost. I told her earlier, and it made me cry, that every time it said Rocky Flats, I could have inserted Fernald, and every time it said plutonium, I could have inserted uranium. It's like this everywhere. And there were some women in the community, a nurse specifically, who began to ask some questions about this dust that was being released. And I can't quote pound each and all this stuff anymore. I just can't do it. It was heavy dust. This was well-behaved dust. Came out of the stacks, went right back down on the ground. Never left 1,050 acres, ever. Well-behaved dust. Then, late in the year of 84, early 85, there was reports of 3 off-site contaminated wells in this community. My husband and I lived in a rented farmhouse directly across the street from this facility. Red and white checkerboard water tower, feed materials production center, little Dutch boy paint guy down in the corner of the sign. Nobody really knew what they did there. You know, again, it mirrors Christian's story. You know, people said they made Dutch boy paint, dog food, you name it. So in early 85, there were talks of 3 off-site contaminated wells, and mine happened to be one of them. Had been contaminated for 5 years, and we had never been told. You know, I had a 7-year-old at the time. It rips your heart out. It makes you mad. And that's what I think did it for us, is the mothers of this community said, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to stand up and we're going to fight because you're not going to contaminate and make our kids unhealthy. You're not going to do it. So, Fresh was formed. The men stayed home with the kids and the women went out and raised Holy Living Hell. We were called crazy housewives, get a job. I had a full-time job. Everybody in this organization worked full-time. I worked in a mental hospital, honey. Talk to me. Talk to me about working in a mental hospital and dealing with the DOE on the side. Many times I would have loved to have put them in a room all by themselves. We found us a lawyer. You don't know what to do. You really don't know what to do. And a friend of mine suggested we talk to this lawyer named Stan Chesley, and immediately a class action lawsuit was filed. If you've never been through a class action lawsuit, talk to me. Psych evaluations, 10, 12, 14-hour depositions, poked around in every aspect of your life. Everything. If you've got a secret, you don't have it anymore, believe me. And we all have skeletons in our closets, I'm sorry. I know I have a few, which everybody knows about now. I'm trying to just set the stage for you. 1985, front page, Cincinnati Enquirer, top fold. Every single day that year, there was a story about Fernald. The one thing with a class action lawsuit is you learn a lot of information. Through discovery, through interrogatories, and you learn all these words as you go along. And everything we got, we gave. We made friends with the media. We fed them everything we could get our hands on. In the interrogatories is where you exchange questions with one another. One of the questions was, why was this done and why weren't these people told? And the DOE's answer was, because they didn't need to know. We did this, we knowingly and willingly did this, and there's really not a damn thing you can do about it. So I want to say this too. In 1986, when all the stuff happened with Chernobyl, people in our community, people were outraged. Oh my God, look what happened at Chernobyl. And one of my Fresh members, who has now passed away, said, you're outraged over Chernobyl. Why aren't you outraged about what's happening in your own damn backyard? It's like, come on. We kicked the DOE's door down. We didn't take no for an answer. We just raised Holy Living Hell, exposed them for everything we could expose them for. You can, because this is too much for me. And I think this was a group of mostly women. Nobody got paid in this organization. Everybody was a volunteer. I was a volunteer coordinator at the mental hospital, so I did know how to coordinate volunteers. But I think that made us a much stronger organization. Volunteers do really good work because you're working hard and you're not getting paid. I think when I took my first airplane flight, as Bill Mitchell talks about, to Colorado, I'd never been on a plane before. I was absolutely terrified, sitting in white-knuckled, and I said to my husband before we left, I was like 28, 30 years old then. I said, if these people are really weird, don't go home, but don't go anywhere, because I may have to call you and say, come and get me at the airport. I'm not staying. And we've met wonderful, great people through the years. The site ceased, I tell you what they did, and this is the lesson learned, I think. In 1986, when they stopped 1989, when they stopped production at the site, they literally just hit the switches. left everything in the lines, left everything the way it was, barrels everywhere, waste pits dug in the ground with buried contamination in them everywhere. You know, a huge contaminated aquifer. They just turned it off and hit the switches. You know, God, common sense would tell you to finish what you were doing before you turned the switches off. We talk about lessons learned, and God, I hope that's one of them. It probably didn't sink in. The site also, there were cows, you saw the cows grazing out in the front. I mean, how great does this make this place look when you have dairy cattle grazing in front of the property, you know? I mean, we had rusty barrels everywhere. We had an effluent line that went from the site to the Great Miami River that they just dumped and dumped and dumped into. Hundreds and hundreds of pounds of uranium into the Great Miami River. The two K-65 silos, these humongous, monstrous cement things with caps on them and dirt around them, were under the cover of darkness. This waste was brought in through New York City into Cincinnati to Fernald, so the government could put Pershing missiles in somewhere. I can't remember where that even was now. You know, you don't ask anybody. This is the part that gets me, is you don't ask anybody. Fresh, like I said, we were the first community organization to get to take a tour of the DOE, of a DOE site. And I don't know how we finagled this with our Congress folks. And we got there that day, and I said, the only way I'm going is if I can carry my rad alert and a camera. You know, I was a media darling, you know. You want to talk to me? I'll talk to you. Come on, let's do it. We got there that day, and the PR guy said, you can't bring your camera. I said, then we're not going. We'll just go out in the parking lot and have a press conference. We took our cameras. We took our rad alerts. You know, two can play this game. We also created a health map. Edwa, this is one of my other cohorts in crime. One of our members had been gathering data and information from people in the community who had died or had cancer or had other health issues. So we laid on Edwa's kitchen floor one night with this map, it's crude, you know, and put pins, red pins for people who were sick with cancer and black pins for people who had died. And I think when we got done, and we had about 300 names at that point, and we stood it up, it was just so overwhelming, because directly the way the wind blew and directly the way the water flew, you could just see this pattern. Of course, we took it to a fresh meeting, and the DOE poo-pawed, oh, well, you know, that's not scientific, and it's pretty damn scientific to me. You know, I'm not a PhD, I'm not a scientist, I'm a little bit of an egghead since Arjun taught me how to be one. But, you know, don't talk about my stuff. I think through the advisory board process, you know, we started to work on the balanced approach, and I think a lot of that came through MPN and ANA of not being a NIMBY, and, you know, decisions were starting to be made about what do you do with your waste, and, you know, where are you going to send it, and, you know, where are you going to bury it, and all this stuff. And I think we had to go back as a community and say, you know, we're not going to be NIMBYs here. And we did the balanced approach. We kept 85% of our waste on the Fernald site. Anything that was under our waste criteria acceptance level, we kept, and the rest did go off-site. And I think, I really think that was the most helpful thing, was talking to other people. You know, we met with the Nevada Test Site Advisory Board. We brought them to Fernald. We went to the test site. You know, you had to make those connections with each other and talk to each other, and, you know, if we keep this, will you take that? Well, we ended up getting screwed in the end, but, you know, it wasn't their fault. And the advisory board came at a time for us at Fernald that we were really getting close to being in over our heads, and we knew we needed some help, and we needed it really quick. We were getting ready to go into the remedial investigation feasibility study. We were getting ready to write RODs and do milestones and all this stuff. And, you know, so that, we needed them. And I think that was another real helpful thing for us. I'll just fast forward like 22 years. And we finished, we did our cleanup. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is it safe? I believe it's safe at this point. I think we got the best we could have possibly gotten. We have a humongous on-site disposal facility that holds our waste. That's our legacy. That's our part of being part of the nuclear weapons complex. That's the way it is. We are a protected green space now. We have a great visitor center. We have a museum that sort of tells our story. I still quibble with that a little, but I didn't pay for it, so that's okay. DOE, one of the things they called it weapons to wetlands, and that just rubs me the wrong way a little bit. You know, I won't go into it, but I just want you to know that there are people like me, you know, we're not real smart, we're not great, we don't get everything, but when you threaten somebody's children and you threaten the health and safety of their lives, they do have a right to get mad and fight back.
I'm Marylia Kelley. I'm Executive Director at Tri-Valley Cares, which stands for Communities Against a Radioactive Environment in Livermore, California, right next to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Every nuclear weapon in the United States arsenal. On. Every nuclear weapon in the United States arsenal was either designed at Lawrence Livermore in California or at Los Alamos in New Mexico. Susan asked me to speak a little bit about how, through the MPN and Alliance for Nuclear Accountability's grassroots groups work on national issues. So I'll try to tell a couple of those stories very short. Tri-Valley Cares was founded in 1983. We decided that peace issues, justice issues, and environmental issues were inextricably linked at their root. And then after we were founded, we were an all-volunteer group. We began to meet other groups, and this process accelerated exponentially because of the military production network, and to understand that other groups were making the same connections at their sites, each in their own way. And just sort of historically, the moral argument against nuclear weapons had already been very well explicated by about 1983 when we were founded. And we agree with them. And the guns versus butter, the economic arguments, which we still make, had been pretty well developed. What the groups in this room were part of developing was the environmental and health argument, that connection between nuclear weapons, research, development, testing, manufacture, and deployment, and the health and environmental impacts in those communities all across the country. That was not very well developed until the 80s. And each of our groups was doing it in our own way, as you heard in the morning. And then by getting together and sharing information and making sure that a group's success in one part of the country didn't become a group's problem in another part of the country is really at the heart of the MPN ANA story. I met Bill Mitchell when he called me on the phone and asked to come and meet me. It was about 1988, 1989. We were an all-volunteer group. It was almost a full year before I could get time off of work in order to attend my first meeting, which I believe was late in 1989. And it marked a broadening of the military production network. because it was founded with the production sites, hence the name, which was already there when I got there. We were from a nuclear weapons laboratory. It was not shut down. It was very active. And so that whole weapons development and testing then became part of MPN and ANA. And the network has been incredibly good about sort of growing in a really logical, organic kind of way. And the issues we understood were at once local and at once national in terms of policy. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples among hundreds. There was a nuclear bunker buster that was proposed during the Bush administration, the Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrating Bomb, or RNEP. Some of you may not, oh, move it back, thank you. Apologies. Some of you may not have heard of it. This is because it never got developed. The more things that nobody hears about, it means that we've won. Very quickly, it was the local groups that were part of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability who immediately understood what that was. In fact, it was a Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory design that was being adapted to give it advanced earth-penetrating capability, as they called it. So a lot of the early research, analysis, publications, fact sheets, reports, advocacy, going to talk to Congress to cut its funding, going to talk to administration offices, came from the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. And we worked also with other groups across the country. So I'm not saying it was all us, but a lot of the early information and early understanding about its importance came from those of us who lived and worked at the sites. I just brought a single little press release that Bob Schaeffer did after ANA DC days called Secret Pentagon Documents Call for Usable Nuclear Weapons. There's actually several of them because we heard when we were in DC that they were supposedly within several weeks of the Pentagon issuing a need for this. And once there's a military requirement, it becomes much more difficult to stop. Not impossible, but more difficult. That military requirement was never issued. That bomb was never designed. So then the nuclear weapons designers came back with something called the Reliable Replacement Warhead Program, or RRW. They did learn one lesson: don't name something where people understand what it is. It was the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability groups who jumped on it early. And we worked with a lot of DC-based groups, and so this is not intended to be a slur, but it was actually the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability groups who wanted to go after its funding early and helped convince our allies to join together in a campaign to go after its funding. And that is ultimately what stopped this nuclear weapon from being developed. And we talked to then Senator Obama, who became President Obama, and he tried to put the nail in the coffin by declaring it official policy that that weapon would not be developed. And we are still working on these issues because now they've come back through something called life extension programs. It's actually government, single-payer, universal health care. It's just not for people, it's for nuclear weapons. And so we're working to constrain that program so that new designs don't happen under the rubric of life extension programs. And I have less than 3 minutes, so I want to just offer one more very quick vignette. Over on the cleanup and environmental protection side of ANA's work, the Department of Energy came out with something called risk-based end states. You may have noticed that that was listed, killing that as one of our achievements, which it was. Well, at many of our sites, we noticed that risk-based end states was going to, in fact, subvert the Superfund law. It was going to be what we call getting variance. It was going to be a variance-based end state kind of thing. It was going to affect the quality of cleanup at just about every Department of Energy site. And I really honestly believe it was the collective work that we did, commenting on how it was going to affect our site at our site, but working together nationally, that ultimately stopped that program and literally saved the Superfund law from being gutted. So I want to just offer those as three of many examples where, by working collaboratively, the groups in ANA and ANA itself have, from bringing our unique grassroots knowledge and our unique grassroots experience to the national level, have changed policy, both in terms of nuclear weapons policy and in terms of our environmental laws and environmental policy. Thank you.
Osio, Tohija, traditional greetings from Cherokee, Pamela Kingfisher, born to the Bird Clan, which makes us messengers. But more importantly than that, I'm a daughter of plutonium. I was born and raised in Hanford. My father started there in 1943 as a guard at the gate. They gave that man a gun. And I think collectively within my family, we have about 80 years at Hanford. My brother ran a nuclear power plant there for 30 years. My father was there 30 years. I still have family there today. I started asking questions, and apparently I thought all the wrong ones, but they were the right ones in about 4th or 5th grade. Hearing the stories about Daddy saying, yeah, they drive out in the trucks at night and sleep and make up good numbers. They don't even check the tank levels. And, you know, so I started knowing this in the 60s as a young, pretty impressionable person. I'm kind of the oddball in my family. I'm really the only one that cared about culture, that cared about who we were, that cared about the animals. I had all the horses that, you know, the boys had gone on to race cars and girls and things like that. So I just was sort of the odd one out, and it meant it was very easy for me to leave and to, you know, go on and out into my life. But to be born and raised on the fence line, where we knew the rabbits were hot, we knew the rattlesnakes were hot. They're still testing the rabbits. What I hear, the bunny patrol, the money bunnies, the bunny money patrol, whatever it is they're calling it now, you know, they're still chasing and picking up bunny poo. They're paying people to go pick up radioactive bunny poo. I mean, this is just unbelievable to me. But coming to I moved to Oklahoma and discovered that I was near a Kerr-McGee uranium conversion facility. I had no clue what that meant. I knew that Hanford made the plutonium. I knew that all of our fathers in our town made the bomb. That's about all we knew. We knew to tuck and roll. We learned all that in the late 50s, early 60s, but we didn't know what any of it meant. Science, I don't know, it just didn't quite, I don't know if they talked about it at school. I don't really know that we had that class. I've just continued to hear the story throughout the day of we didn't know what was going on there. There were no rumors about Hanford. We knew it was the bomb, but nobody talked. Nobody's daddies talked. It just didn't happen. So there were these mysteries in my life of what does it mean my daddy built the bomb? What does it mean I'm Cherokee? And those have been the two paths that I've followed my whole life. Going to Oklahoma and discovering that I was 30 miles upstream from a uranium conversion facility owned by Kerr-McGee after they had killed Karen Silkwood. They were burying the hot tanks and trucks from her site over at our site. The rods that Karen exposed were coming to Hanford. I started to make the connections, and I don't know, someone with a better memory than I will remember how I ended up in the room at MPN at cool font eating pie or whatever we were doing. But it changed my life. Every one of you in these groups changed my life and made me see the bigger picture. And to understand that, you know, we can go back to the treaties and talk about that, but when they wanted some land that was out in the middle of nowhere, oh, let's just move those Indians, or, you know, let's just get them off of there. So we can talk about Washington, Idaho, probably every site was native lands. And these were ceded territories that were then retaken, and hopefully will never be given back to us, although that may start to happen, you know. So it just learning that Native Americans are impacted, you know, I want to draw a big circle, and it's land, health, foods, and culture. And it's all connected, and you cannot separate it. So it has affected us in every way possible. If we don't have our territories to hunt on, if we don't have our traditional foods, if all the rabbits are hot, you know, I mean, we're moved away from our medicines and from our waters and from where we should be. So to know that from yellow cake in New Mexico on the Navajo lands, where 75% of the United States uranium yellow cake comes out of, and they've just left massive piles that are there still blowing. The mines where they mined it, and Kerr-McGee owned those mines, and when they drove trucks from Oklahoma out to Quivira mine, they just left the spigot on a little bit. So by the time they got to New Mexico, it was empty. But we were finding out these things, and coming to an MPN meeting back in the 80s, late 80s, I guess I was here pretty early, just blew my mind and opened it up to know and see the whole fuel cycle and to understand where natives fit all the way along the cycle from yellow cake to waste. When the United States government hired a waste negotiator to come out to tribes to pay them $250,000 to have a conversation, to pay them $500,000 to have the next let's look at paper, you know, and then how many millions if you'll take the monitored retrievable storage, and we just called it more diseased blankets. You know, hello, been there, done that, we get this picture. But when the waste negotiator showed up at the Sac and Fox Nation, he lit a fire that he didn't realize he should have stayed away from. Miss Grace Thorpe, the daughter of Jim Thorpe, called Lance Hughes and just went off like a rocket. She was actually at the tribal council meeting, running outside, calling Lance on the payphone, you know, going, what does this mean? He's here, he's trying to sell it to the tribe, my tribal council wants it. It's really hard to speak of the people that we've lost because these were amazing warriors who just stood up, and I've learned so much from them, from all of you, and to know that they're not with us, but we're still carrying on. You know, the Holly Near song, Karen Silkwood, we're doing it for you, we're doing it for two. And there's so many more than two that we're all still doing it for. So we must bring up and mentor these young ones and let them know, and the families of the families. And even in my family, you know, there's nobody here, obviously. They're not going to listen to, you know, what I have to say. My brother that ran the power plant, we could really have that conversation until he developed myelofibrosis, and I had to give stem cells, and, you know, he could make no blood. His bone marrow turned to fibrous tissue, and don't tell me that wasn't from working at Hanford forever. So a NACE was formed in 1982. They were going to deep well inject waste. We didn't know what that meant. We're Okies. We're like out in the middle of nowhere in a big red state. You know, by 89, 90, NACE was being just inundated with phone calls. How did you do this? How do you raise money? How do you organize, from other tribes that were being approached? And they asked us to become the Indigenous Environmental Network. And we had to make a decision. Are we going to help the rest of the natives and spend our time doing that? Or are we going to shut this plant down? And we just stopped with all of the national organizing and focused. We told Greenpeace, don't you dare drive that bus in our state. We'll run you out on a rail. This is ours and we're going to kill it. And we did. By 1993, Kerr-McGee in 90 had sold to General Atomics. In 93, they shut down overnight on a Saturday night. They'd had an explosion, killed one man earlier, and then they had just a complete breakdown. Nobody evacuated. You know, we did all kinds of media. We never could do what we did in the media now. Our pictures, our names, our stories, the cancer map, the cows. I mean, just everything everybody said. Monsanto went together and bought 5,000 acres and dumped the happy cow scene was around the fence, and they had the cow dumps in the middle because they were spraying raffinate. They had created fertilizer out of the sludge in the toxic bottoms of the ponds. So I could go on for days, and it's a huge story to try to tell. And the company walked away. They moved the money in the middle of the night. They changed their name. They made a new corporation. They have never paid for the cleanup. It's now a Superfund site. Arjun and Diane Curran, Lance found Diane. Diane found us, Arjun, and somehow we all found you. We couldn't have done it without you. There's been other natives come and go. We didn't have the issues, I think, of the Hispanics and the anger and the, oh, you white people stuff. I was just so happy to be fed and to know that I had friends doing the same thing, crying about the same stories, all around the country. I just felt so connected that we had y'all. And so I don't know, there's so many stories. I just can't even go on. All the toxic tours. I mean, the bonding in the middle of these most contaminated sites in the country, and to know that it's up to us. We are the ones we're waiting for, but we've got to reach behind. I think natives we go back into our communities. We have a lot of young people that are fighting the pipelines. We've got a lot of young folks out there. Not quite so many nuke heads, but we really have to make that bridge and bridge that gap, because the amount of information in this room is volumes, and we can't lose it. So I'm so honored and pleased to be here today. Wado, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very good sound to start my own story, because my story also about American-Russian NGO connections for nuclear accountability, and about our future in context of drama of the new Cold War. So my entire story about connections and actions. Activists of Movement for Nuclear Safety and Military Production Network, later Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, being citizens of nuclear states, recognize each other very fast as partners and have done great job for the last 25 years. We overcome serious barriers between our communities. The first was distrust as the legacy challenge of the Cold War. The second was language. We historically talk on different languages, and these different languages form different culture of interactions and interconnections, and we need to remember about this. The third was tool of communications. Likely we live in time of informational shift from limited telephone toward to unlimited internet. When I grow up, I stayed in the line for telephone in my house 20 years. And now we use cell phone and we use SMS, and we connect in 1 second. And we need to put it in our mind, this huge opportunity what we have now. So, and this, so we use this very effectively. And we recognized each other because we was linked by our common understanding of nuclear legacy. And that became obvious after President Clinton and his staff, and particularly Mrs. Hazel Aliri, whom I met in 1994 in Moscow, dared to lead to new openness in nuclear policy. The beginnings of 90s was hopeful time for Russia also, and I was working for this, our common hopes. I remember my talk with American officials in 1998 at ADC days, which I participate several decades, more than one decade. It was
kindergarten.
Yes, it was right after MNS did our first Moscow days. Officials asked me, Natalia, what in your mind the most important help we can do for your bureaucracy to become more accountable in nuclear safety? And my answer was computerization. The disconnectedness of Russian authorities' entities, low level of information in decision-making process, and ignoring systemic approach, systemic view on the nuclear legacy and nuclear complex were my most troubled conclusion of Moscow DC days. Huge number of mistakes with nuclear waste disposal, what we have in Russia, and later we recognize in the United States also, with enormous volumes of weapons-grade material, highly enriched uranium, plutonium, and tritium. In my region, plutonium, tritium, and uranium was in the full bouquet. Was a result of disconnectedness decision-making actors among themselves and with public as well. So MNS ANA connections for more than 20 years helped both of us provide bilateral public educational program, which was very, very effective, and help us overcome barriers and distrust and culture, and we do it with great benefit. This benefit is new generation of informed activists and citizens who are focused on nuclear issues and became professional watchdogs as a lawyer, as a radiochemistry specialist, as an environmentalist, pediatrician, and simply as informed citizens. Political situation in Russia now is threatening as never ever was before for last 25 years. Grassroots NGO labeled as a foreign spy. Moreover, and this is one day before I found new Putin initiative about this in this field of spy, state secrecy, and so on. So, and moreover, criticizing of Russian nuclear policy became deadly and dangerous, mostly after Putin came to grasp power. State machinery works to suppress civil society. In that context, idea of the next so-called war of the American-Russian Cold War is on the way. And you can ask me how powers do it. And I cannot give you a right answer, but Caesar gave. Caesar gave a very vibrant explanation. This is 2,000 years ago. Caesar was the emperor of the Rome. He explained the political picture of nowadays. Beware the leader who banged the drum of war in order to whip the citizenry into the patriotic fervor. For patriotism is indeed a double-edged sword. In both, embolden the blood just as in it narrow the mind. And when the drums of the war have reached a fever pitch, and the blood boils with hate, and the mind has closed, the leader will have no needs to seizing the rights of the citizenry. Rather, the citizenry, infused with fear and blinded by patriotism, will offer up all of their rights into the leader, and gladly so. How I know? For that it what I have done, and I am Caesar. And not a secret that we have now a modern version of such Caesarism in Russia, which will play with patriotism and nationalism very effectively. But the authority cannot push the world clock into the past, cannot change informational trend, cannot prevent attractiveness for new generation, the cross-border social networking, and benefit emerge with this activity. Freedom of thinking, common language, common culture, and common values of life. I will give you a short example. 2011, Chelyabinsk governor, Chelyabinsk, this is region where I live, who is very supportive to nuclear industry, ordered cleanup of critical opinion on Mayak facility, huge first nuclear bomb facility in Russia, very dirty. This is nuclear enterprises. And the cleanup was not only in political space, but also in internet space. What was up as a result? The taxpayer money was spent successfully, but several months later, the number of critical or simply truthful information about Mayak was increased. And I even don't know who our supporters are. What I know that it is young people who know how such information in internet and create its own. The only one what I did, I triggered flow of discussion on stupidity of governor order. Since 1989, the MNS network has advocated for nuclear safety in Russia and taught for the human rights of radiation victims. And we learn a lot from Alliance of Nuclear Accountability and from other groups which I met here. Yes. MNS fought to prevent proliferation of nuclear technology, nuclear weapons technology, such as breeder reactors and reprocessing of the MOX fuel. Since 1994, MNS attempted to provide international examination for radiation effect for public health for the local village Muslumovo, downstream of the nuclear Mayak nuclear complex. In 2011, right after Fukushima disaster, MNS did Chernobyl lesson tour across the Russia. The same year, we did in cooperation with other organizations, big for 6 nations, a legal workshop about modernizing nuclear region and regions with nuclear power. And in 2012, we established Energy Future Working Group. As a result of my long-term activity, I became a target for political persecution. I gone through a pressure connected with my work threats and most recently even physical assaults. Looking forward, contemporary political reality in Russia has tendency to become more threatening. NGO is in critical situation of self-defense. They involved in political game, which I would call a Russian roulette. In this context, we have to develop new approaches. We need to rethink the way of effective work in nuclear sphere in Russia in new political environment. Thus, this is my plans for our next cooperation, and we have good background for that. And thank you for your attention, and congratulations with Anna 25th anniversary.
I'm going to stand, both because when we do speakers training, we tell you to do that, and I don't want to be a hypocrite. And secondly, I don't want to be sitting between Lisa and Pam, because they'll either hit me or make me cry. My initial introduction to the network came courtesy of the Plowshares Fund back in 1988. Wayne Jaquez was the outgoing director of the Plowshares Fund at that time, and who many of you know because he still comes to DC days, and who I knew from Boston. He'd been the director of the Lawyers Alliance for Nuclear Arms Control, approached me about the possibility of doing training for their grantees around the country, dealing with nuclear weapons and related issues. And he came up with a list of potential groups that could perhaps benefit from this training. And on that list, which I actually was able to dig out of a file, were many of the folks in your organizations that were in this room. Ultimately, Wayne, as I think a going-away gift from the Plowshares Fund, gave me a grant to do 10 trainings. His successors at Plowshares, Mike McCauley and Karen Paget, Karen, that's not her last name, Karen Harris. Karen Paget's a different woman of the same world, ultimately funded me to do, I think, 34 trainings around the country, and that was all because of the commitment of Sally Lilienthal, the founder of Plowshares, to strengthen you guys. Because of this, I had the opportunity to visit all the NA groups in this room, to see your sites, to see your offices, to meet many of your members, to stay in your guest bedrooms. Yes, yes, yes. I didn't stay in Natalia's guest room. Susan did, but I visited there. Jay and I were staying in Andre's guest bedroom when we did the first DC days. But you get a unique understanding, a unique window into what your lives are like by seeing that your home and your office, it's a convergence, it's a full-time commitment. Along the way, early on, I met Bill Mitchell, who'd been connected to me through a variety of ways. And Bill invited me to do a training as part of the Plowshares grant right after the first DC days. In the course of that, he shared with me minutes of the early meetings, which I'm going to read you little bits and pieces to show how smart you were. I'm not going to read you the boring parts in minutes, but to see how prescient you were about what it took to build a strong network. And I met many of the folk in this room back in Harper's Ferry in 1989, right after the first DC days. Among other things, I got to see the briefing book from the first DC days. This was the briefing book that you all tried to convince Congress made sense. We do them a little bit differently nowadays. But even back then, there was the understanding that you need both expertise and passion and a bunch of other things. The perspective I have about this thing, I don't know what rightfully called. We call it the Alliance, or they were used to call it the network. It's totally different than everything else out there on the progressive advocacy scene, at least in my experience. I've worked closely with what used to be called the Military Toxics Project and with a number of nuclear power organizations. This thing, MPN, ANA, is a complex system. I started off as a biology major before deciding that you could actually get paid for doing the work you love. I can't come up with a perfect biological metaphor. Maybe it's like, it's like a colony of coral or something like that, which are independent but well connected, and that connection makes them much stronger. Though you guys are a lot less passive than coral by every means. And trying to understand this system, let's call it, I see 5 key characteristics that makes the organism, the whole, and the separate entities particularly strong. And first, and several people have referred to this already, is the neural system, the communications infrastructure that from the very beginning has made it possible to instantaneously communicate across the country about what the bad guys at DOE were doing and what the good women on our side were doing. It's largely women who are the head of these organizations, were doing to stop it and thwart it. And you know, the mentions of things like Environet that Greenpeace provided for me and the free conference calls. There isn't another network that does that now, 25 years later, as far as I know. And that built the connections and passed the information down and up the neural system. Now we use modern technologies as well. We use Facebook, we use Twitter, we use the website, of course, but that instantaneous connection. This is one factoid. Back in 1989, Environet gave us instant messaging capacity. You could interrupt somebody online, if they happen to be online, and send them a message. You know, wow, my kid, when he learned about that, 5 years ago, thought it was something brand new. We were doing it, you were doing it, probably by 1990s. Second thing this system did to become super strong is it focused a lot, and I give Bill tremendous credit for this, on capacity building. Not just the circuit riding media work training in public speaking and whatever else training that I did, but every meeting has had a skills training in addition to a technical training. We've had training on fundraising skills with Kim Klein, and training on diversity and dismantling racism with Andrea Vazian. I mean, people who are the best in the country at this were brought to ANA and made available to you because you asked for it. And the third thing that you've done in that same sort of capacity building is you understand that expertise doesn't necessarily fly in and get off a plane, that you're all the experts too. And so there was funding from early on to do cross-travel and cross-training. Minutes from the second ANA meeting at Blue Mountain Center, 1988. 2 practical creative ideas were identified for meeting the ongoing needs of network participants. First, a cross-training project for local and national organizations, which would allow it for an exchange of perspectives. The purposes of the cross-training are to enhance the level of understanding and trust, more about that in a moment, among the organizations, and to build upon the collective skills and expertise already present in the group. Second related idea was to develop an inexpensive computer communications bulletin board system we've already talked about. So the capacity building was important. The third thing this organism, system, whatever did was coordinated actions, beginning with that first DC days, actually called Lobby Week back in that day, or Lobby Days. They integrated actions around the country around the Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, or PEIS, in which we tried to make it into a national referendum on the future of the weapons complex, and the fact that you all, as of next spring, will have done 25 DC days to move the message. Fourth interesting characteristic, collective characteristic, is that organisms that get strong have to feed themselves. And one of the focuses of MPN-ANA has been on joint fundraising. We've done several funders briefings to collectively and individually expose groups. We've done briefing books for funders, etc. And the fifth, and I think intangible, but maybe the most important, is this organism has developed a sense of mutual respect and, over the years, not initially, trust. That we believe that other people in this room are not going to screw us and that they're going to do what's right. There was a lot of talk, Bill and I were chatting about this, about the hidden hand early on, and that there's somehow a secret agenda being run by people who I still don't know who they were. But it's not. There is a hidden hand. I will reveal it. It's every one of you who runs this organism. So collectively, the community groups and our national allies are the core element of this system. MPN-ANA, the network, is a largely invisible glue. It's the connective tissue that makes all the components of this work together and makes a higher level of functioning possible. The successes of the past 25 years, take a look at the list. They're not terribly exaggerated. reflect what is a unique institution and set of individual components on the U.S. activism scene, at least as far as I've seen it. The accomplishments show that this is really a higher level organism, an entity that is uniquely potent in the world of social change, and all of you are the reason why that's taking place. Let's do the next 25 years even better and shut it all down. And clean it up.